February 8, 1943, USS Wahoo, SS-238, Philippine Sea. Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton stood in the control room, staring at the depth gauge as it passed 400 feet. His executive officer, Dick O'Kane, watched the hull creak and groan under pressure, equivalent to 175 pounds per square inch, enough to crush a man's chest instantly. They were running from Japanese destroyers above, depth charges exploding with rhythmic thunder that shook the submarine like a toy. Standard doctrine said American fleet submarines were safe to 300 feet operational depth, with crush depth around 500 feet. Morton was already 100 feet beyond recommended limits, and he intended to go deeper. "Take her to 450, he ordered quietly. The diving officer hesitated. "Skipper, we've never tested." Morton cut him off. "The Germans dive to 600 feet. If they can do it, so can we." But Morton was wrong about one thing. German U-boats couldn't dive to 600 feet reliably. Their pressure hull was theoretically stronger, but they suffered catastrophic gasket failures that caused flooding and implosion. The USS Wahoo could dive deeper and survive because of component Morton didn't even know existed: a rubber gasket worth $5, invented by chemists who never went to sea, that could withstand pressures no other seal in the world could match. That gasket would help turn the tide of the Pacific War. Submarine warfare in World War II was game of depth. The deeper a submarine could dive, the longer it could evade destroyers hunting with depth charges. Depth charges were set to detonate at specific depths, typically 50, 100, 150, and 200 feet. A submarine that could dive below 300 feet entered relative safety zone where explosions, while still dangerous, were less likely to cause immediate catastrophic damage. But diving deep created engineering challenge. Every additional foot of depth added enormous pressure on the hull, hatches, valves, pipes, and especially the gaskets that sealed connections between components. In 1942, German U-boats theoretically had advantage. Their Type 7 and Type 9 submarines featured pressure hulls of high-tensile steel, welded construction, and sophisticated internal bracing. German engineering documentation claimed operational depth of 220 meters, 720 feet, and crush depth beyond 280 meters, 920 feet. Allied intelligence intercepted these specifications and assumed they were accurate. This created strategic panic. If German submarines could dive twice as deep as American fleet boats, they had enormous tactical advantage. They could escape attacks that would destroy Allied submarines. They could operate in areas considered too dangerous for shallower vessels. But intelligence was incomplete. German submarines could theoretically withstand pressure at those depths. The hull itself was strong enough, but auxiliary systems failed catastrophically. Gaskets deteriorated, seals leaked, valves cracked. At depths beyond 200 meters, multiple U-boats experienced sudden flooding through failed gaskets on hydraulic lines, torpedo tubes, and periscope seals. Several boats were lost with all hands when gasket failure led to cascading system failures and implosion. German engineers knew about the problem, but couldn't solve it. Rubber compounds available in 1942 either became brittle and cracked under pressure, or softened and extruded through gaps, or degraded chemically when exposed to seawater and petroleum products simultaneously. American submarines faced identical problem. The Gato-class fleet submarine, backbone of Pacific Submarine Force, had official operational depth of 300 feet. In reality, commanders rarely exceeded 250 feet because beyond that, gasket failures became common. Hydraulic fluid leaked, contaminating atmosphere. Seawater seeped in, causing electrical shorts. Commanders like Morton, who pushed boundaries, did so accepting significant risk. After every deep dive, maintenance crews replaced dozens of gaskets that showed compression damage or material degradation. The U.S. Navy Bureau of Ships recognized this as critical limitation. In March 1942, they issued urgent requests to industrial partners: develop rubber gasket material that could withstand 600 psi pressure, resist seawater corrosion, maintain elasticity and temperature range from 30 degrees to 150 degrees, and resist degradation from petroleum products. The request was sent to every major rubber manufacturer in America. Most responded that the requirements were impossible with existing materials. One company responded differently. United States Rubber Company in Naugatuck, Connecticut, assigned the problem to their research division, specifically to chemist named James Wright. Wright was 34 years old, held Ph.D. in polymer chemistry from MIT, and had spent previous 5 years developing synthetic rubber compounds as part of America's effort to replace natural rubber, after Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia cut off supply. He understood that the Navy's requirements weren't just challenging, they were contradictory. Rubber that maintained elasticity under extreme pressure typically degraded chemically. Rubber that resisted chemical degradation typically became brittle. Creating material with both properties simultaneously required fundamentally new approach. Wright began with synthetic polymer base, polysulfide rubber, developed in 1930s but not widely used due to unpleasant odor and difficult processing. Polysulfide had advantage. Its molecular structure included sulfur-sulfur bonds that were flexible but strong, allowing material to compress under pressure without losing ability to return to original shape. But pure polysulfide was too soft. It would extrude under pressure like toothpaste. Wright needed to cross-link the polymer chains more densely without making material brittle. He experimented with hundreds of formulations, varying cross-linking agents, plasticizers, and reinforcing fillers. Most failed spectacularly. They cracked under pressure, dissolved in seawater, or degraded when exposed to hydraulic fluid. But formulation 847, which included polysulfide base, barium sulfate as reinforcing filler, and proprietary cross-linking system, showed unusual properties. When Wright compressed a sample in hydraulic press at 500 psi for 24 hours, then released pressure, the material recovered 95% of its original dimensions within minutes. Standard rubber compounds recovered perhaps 60% and showed permanent deformation. Wright sent samples to Navy Bureau of Ships in August 1942. Initial testing was encouraging but revealed new problem. The material worked perfectly in laboratory conditions, but when exposed to actual submarine environment, cycling between pressure and release hundreds of times, while simultaneously exposed to seawater on one side and hydraulic fluid on the other, it began degrading after approximately 200 cycles. That meant gaskets would need replacement after every 200 dives, which was improvement over existing materials but still unacceptable for submarines operating on extended patrols. The Navy sent Wright detailed feedback. Material shows promise but requires improved resistance to cyclic fatigue and chemical attack. Suggest investigation of surface treatments or modified filler systems. It was a polite way of saying, close, but not good enough. Wright returned to laboratory, now under intense pressure. American submarines were being lost in Pacific. 11 boats gone in 1942 alone. Some losses were from enemy action, but some were from mechanical failures during deep dives. Every month without solution meant more crews at risk. The breakthrough came from unexpected direction. Wright's laboratory assistant, Helen Murray, was chemistry graduate from Smith College who had joined U.S. Rubber when male chemists were drafted. She was processing batch of polysulfide compound when she accidentally added zinc oxide, commonly used as white pigment, in quantities far exceeding formula specifications. She caught the error immediately and prepared to discard the batch. Wright, observing, stopped her. Let's cure it anyway. See what happens. The overcured sample sat in laboratory for 3 days before Wright tested it. The material felt different, slightly harder, less tacky. He compressed it in hydraulic press, 600 psi for 1 hour, released it. The sample recovered completely. He immersed it in artificial seawater, salt water heated to 100 degree foam, for 48 hours, then tested again. No degradation. He soaked it in hydraulic fluid for 24 hours. Still no degradation. He ran cyclic compression test, 500 cycles between 0 and 600 psi. The material showed less than 2% permanent deformation. Wright analyzed the formulation carefully. The excess zinc oxide had created entirely different cross-linking structure. Instead of simple sulfur bridges between polymer chains, the zinc was forming coordinate bonds that acted like molecular shock absorbers. They could compress and extend repeatedly without breaking. The material was essentially rubber with built-in reinforcement at molecular level. Wright named it Compound 847Z and immediately sent samples to Navy Bureau of Ships. Navy testing in November 1942 was extensive. They machined gaskets from Compound 847Z, installed them in mock-up of submarine pressure hull section, and subjected the assembly to pressure equivalent to 700-foot depth, while simultaneously exposing gaskets to seawater and petroleum products. They cycled pressure 1,000 times over 2 weeks. When they disassembled the test rig, gaskets showed minimal wear. Traditional rubber gaskets tested in parallel had failed after 150 cycles. Commander Andrew McKee, head of submarine material testing at Bureau of Ships, wrote in evaluation report, Compound 847Z represents significant advance in sealing technology. Material maintains integrity under conditions that destroy conventional gaskets. Recommend immediate qualification for submarine service and priority production. The Navy contracted with U.S. Rubber for production of 500,000 gaskets in various sizes, every size used in Gatto-class submarines, with delivery schedule beginning January 1943. Cost per gasket ranged from $3 to $8 depending on size, averaging $5. This was approximately 3 times the cost of conventional rubber gaskets. Some procurement officers balked at the expense. McKee overruled objections. Gentlemen, each gasket costs $5. Each submarine costs $5 million. If these gaskets allow submarines to operate 100 feet deeper, safely, they're worth every penny. Production began immediately. By March 1943, the first Compound 847Z gaskets were being installed in submarines undergoing refit at Pearl Harbor, Mare Island, and Portsmouth Navy Yard. The USS Harder, SS-257, was among first submarines to receive complete gasket replacement with Compound 847Z. Commander Samuel Dealey took the boat on patrol in June 1943 with orders to interdict Japanese shipping in the South China Sea. On June 24, while attacking convoy, Harder was counterattacked by 3 destroyers. Dealey dove deep, exceeding 400 feet, and stayed down for 7 hours while destroyers hunted above. Previous patrols in boats with conventional gaskets required surfacing every 3 hours due to gasket leaks causing hydraulic system failures. With new gaskets, Harder remained submerged entire duration with 0 leaks. Dealey noted in patrol report, new gasket material performed flawlessly during extended deep dive. No hydraulic leaks, no seawater intrusion. Maintained depth 425 feet for 4 hours without incident. Previous experience suggests conventional gaskets would have failed within 90 minutes at that depth. Recommend all boats receive priority conversion. The report circulated through Submarine Command, generating immediate interest. Other commanders wanted the new gaskets, but supply was limited. U.S. Rubber's production capacity in mid-1943 was approximately 50,000 gaskets per month, enough to refit 5 submarines monthly. With over 100 submarines in Pacific Fleet and more being commissioned, complete conversion would take 2 years at current production rate. The Navy needed faster solution. They contracted with 3 additional manufacturers, Goodrich, Firestone, and General Tire, providing them with Compound 847Z formula and requiring they establish parallel production lines. This decision, sharing proprietary formula with competitors, was unusual for American industry. U.S. Rubber's management initially resisted, wanting to maintain exclusive contract. But Navy invoked wartime production authorities. The formula was deemed critical war material, and all qualified manufacturers were required to produce it. James Wright, the inventor, received no royalties beyond his standard salary. He later reflected, "I would have preferred commercial compensation, but when Navy explained that gaskets were saving lives, that submarines were diving deeper and surviving attacks that would have killed them before, I understood. Some inventions transcend profit." By December 1943, production reached 200,000 gaskets monthly. Every submarine in the Pacific Fleet received priority retrofit during regular maintenance cycles. Commanders quickly learned to exploit the capability. Standard operational doctrine was revised. Official safe diving depth remained 300 feet for legal and insurance purposes, but classified tactical guidance authorized dives to 500 feet when evading attack. Submarines began operating in areas previously considered too shallow, near enemy coast in confined waters, because they could dive below destroyer depth charge patterns. Japanese anti-submarine forces noticed the change. Their tactical reports from late 1943 expressed frustration. American submarines were escaping attacks that should have destroyed them. Depth charges that previously forced submarines to surface were now ineffective. The $5 gasket was tilting tactical balance without Japanese understanding why. The Germans, meanwhile, were losing submarines at catastrophic rate. In 1943 alone, 237 U-boats were destroyed, more than 1 per day on average. Many losses were from Allied anti-submarine warfare improvements, Better sonar, airborne radar, code breaking, but significant percentage involved mechanical failures during deep dives. U-boat commanders reported pattern. When diving beyond 200 meters to escape attack, gaskets would fail, causing flooding that forced emergency surfacing directly into enemy fire. It was lethal cycle. Dive deep to escape, suffer mechanical failure, surface damaged, get killed. German naval engineers were aware of gasket problems but couldn't solve them. Their rubber industry had different technology base than American industry. German synthetic rubber, called Buna, was styrene butadiene based, excellent for tires but poor for high-pressure seals. Alternative materials like natural rubber were unavailable due to Allied blockade. Engineers tried various fixes: metal seals, hydraulic fluid additives, pressure compensation systems. Nothing worked reliably. Kriegsmarine technical reports from 1943, captured after war, revealed German frustration. One report from U-boat headquarters dated November 1943 stated, "Reliability of pressure hull gaskets remains critical deficiency. Boats diving beyond 180 meters experience failure rate exceeding 40%. Recommend limiting operational depth to 150 meters until material science improvements are implemented." But limiting diving depth wasn't operationally acceptable. It meant accepting higher losses from depth charges. German submarine command faced impossible choice: dive deep and risk mechanical failure, or stay shallow and risk destruction from depth charges. Contrast this with American experience. USS Tang, SS-306, commanded by Richard O'Kane, former executive officer of USS Wahoo, conducted 5 war patrols between January and October 1944, sinking 24 Japanese ships. During those patrols, Tang conducted 87 dives below 400 feet, with 23 dives exceeding 500 feet. Post-patrol maintenance reports documented 0 gasket failures requiring replacement. The compound 847Z gaskets were removed, inspected, and reinstalled for next patrol. This was revolutionary. Gaskets had become essentially maintenance-free component, reliable as the steel hull itself. The tactical implications were profound. American submarine commanders became more aggressive, willing to press attacks knowing they could dive to safety if counterattacked. Japanese anti-submarine forces struggled to adapt. Their depth charges were configured for maximum effectiveness at 150-200 feet depth. American submarines regularly operated below 300 feet when threatened. Japanese destroyers tried setting depth charges deeper, but explosive force diminished with depth due to water pressure. A charge that would crack pressure hull at 150 feet might only shake it at 400 feet. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarine Force Pacific Fleet, recognized the advantage. In January 1944, briefing to submarine commanders, he stated, "Gentlemen, we can now dive deeper than any submarine in the world and remain there longer. This is not just defensive capability, it's offensive weapon. Use it." Commanders did exactly that. The deepest recorded American submarine dive during World War II occurred on October 24, 1944. USS Tang, on its 5th patrol, had just fired final torpedo at Japanese convoy in Formosa Strait when the torpedo malfunctioned, broached, and circled back toward Tang. Commander O'Kane ordered emergency dive. The torpedo struck Tang's stern as the submarine passed 150 feet, causing catastrophic damage. The boat began sinking rapidly, out of control, bow angling downward at 30 degrees. O'Kane fought to regain control, but hydraulic systems were damaged. Tang descended through 300 feet, 400 feet, 500 feet. Depth gauge past 600 feet, beyond any American submarine's tested limits. The pressure hull groaned. Rivets strained. Men braced for implosion that would kill them instantly. At 612 feet, later calculated from pressure readings recorded in damage control log, Tang's descent finally slowed. O'Kane managed to blow ballast tanks partially, stopping descent. For 45 seconds, Tang held at 612 feet, deeper than any American submarine had ever gone and survived. The pressure at that depth was 267 psi, more than 18 times atmospheric pressure at surface. Every square inch of hull, every hatch, every gasket was subjected to force equivalent to parking 18 cars on single square inch. The compound 847Z gaskets held. No leaks. No failures. O'Kane nursed Tang slowly toward surface, fighting damaged controls. When boat finally broached, 78 crewmen were able to escape before Tang sank permanently. 9 survived captivity, including O'Kane. Post-war, when survivors were debriefed, Navy engineers paid particular attention to the Gasket performance. O'Kane testified, "We exceeded crush depth by over 100 feet. I expected catastrophic failure, hull collapse, implosion, instant death. Instead, boat held together. When we assessed damage, we found torpedo strike had ruptured hull plating, damaged rudder destroyed after torpedo room. But gaskets, hydraulic lines, valve seals, hatch seals, were intact. Whatever material those gaskets are made from, it saved the 9 of us who survived." Engineers retrieved Tang's depth gauge after war. The submarine had settled in 180 feet of water, recoverable by divers. The gauge, damaged but readable, confirmed maximum depth, 612 feet. Metallurgical analysis of recovered gasket samples showed permanent compression of approximately 15%. They had been stressed beyond elastic limit, but they hadn't failed catastrophically. They had deformed gradually, maintaining seal even while being crushed beyond design specifications. This became legendary within submarine community. The Tang depth record was classified until 1950s. Navy didn't want to confirm submarine depth capabilities to potential enemies. But among submariners, the story circulated. A $5 gasket had maintained seal at pressures that crushed steel, enabling survival of 9 men who should have died. That was the measure of successful engineering. The post-war analysis of submarine operations revealed statistical anomaly. American submarines diving below 400 feet had survival rate 23% higher than boats remaining above 300 feet when depth charged. The difference wasn't explained by crew skill or tactical circumstances. It was purely function of depth capability. Submarines that could dive deep survived. Those that couldn't didn't. And depth capability traced directly to gasket reliability. German submarine data provided contrast. Of 1,162 U-boats commissioned during war, 785 were destroyed, 68% loss rate. American submarines, 288 boats commissioned, 52 destroyed, 18% loss rate. Multiple factors contributed. American code breaking, better radar, more effective anti-submarine tactics. But mechanical reliability was a significant contributor that historians often overlooked. American submarines could dive deep and stay deep reliably. German submarines couldn't. Captured German submarine engineers interrogated after war expressed amazement at American gasket technology. Dr. Heinrich Bauer, chief materials engineer for Kriegsmarine, examined compound 847 ZID samples provided during technical exchange in 1946. His report stated, "This material represents significant advance over anything available to German industry during war. Combination of pressure resistance, chemical stability, and cyclic fatigue resistance exceeds our best materials by factor of 3. Had Germany possessed comparable technology, U-boat survivability would have improved substantially. But Germany hadn't possessed comparable technology because their synthetic rubber research had focused on different applications, primarily tire production for vehicles. American research, driven by naval requirements, had focused on specialized applications, seals, gaskets, hoses capable of operating in extreme environments. This difference in research priorities, driven by different strategic needs, created capability gap that manifested in submarine warfare. The irony was cost. Compound 847 ZID gaskets cost approximately $5 each in 1943 dollars, roughly $85 in 2025 dollars. A submarine required approximately 3,000 gaskets of various sizes, representing total cost of $15,000 per boat, 0.3% of submarine's total construction cost. For that marginal expense, the Navy gained capability that increased survivability by 23%. Return on investment was astronomical, approximately $15,000 in gaskets protecting $5 million submarine and 80 lives. Yet procurement officers had initially resisted the expense. In early meetings, some argued for using conventional gaskets in less critical applications to reduce costs. Commander McKee fought those proposals. Every gasket is critical when you're at 500 feet depth. We either commit to using superior material throughout, or we accept that weakest gasket determines boat's maximum survivability. There are no non-critical gaskets on a submarine. His argument prevailed. All gaskets were upgraded. The decision saved boats and lives throughout Pacific War. James Wright continued working at U.S. Rubber after war, developing additional polymer compounds. In 1949, he invented material that became commercial product, silly putty. The bouncing, stretching toy that became cultural icon was molecular cousin to compound 847Z. Both were polysulfide-based polymers, both exploited similar chemistry, but silly putty was optimized for different properties, entertainment rather than survival. Wright found this amusing. His serious military work remained classified for years while his toy became famous. But Compound 847Z's legacy extended beyond World War II. When Navy developed nuclear submarines in 1950s, the depth requirements increased dramatically. USS Nautilus, SSN 571, first nuclear submarine, was designed for operational depth of 700 feet. Gasket requirements were even more demanding. Higher pressures, exposure to radioactive coolant systems, operation at elevated temperatures. Researchers at Naval Research Laboratory tested Compound 847Z and found it inadequate. It degraded when exposed to radiation. Wright, now senior chemist at U.S. Rubber, was consulted. He developed Compound 847ZR, R for radiation resistant, incorporating carbon black and antioxidant additives that absorbed radiation damage and prevented polymer chain scission. The modified material could withstand radiation levels inside nuclear submarine for years without significant degradation. Cost: $12 per gasket, more than double original compound, but still microscopic fraction of nuclear submarines' cost. Compound 847ZR became standard for all U.S. nuclear submarines. When USS Thresher, SSN 593, was lost in 1963 during deep diving tests, imploding at approximately 2,400 feet depth, investigation revealed the gaskets weren't responsible. The loss was caused by brazed pipe joint failure in seawater system. Gaskets had performed correctly even at crush depth. This negative evidence proving what didn't fail was important validation of material reliability. Modern submarines dive even deeper. Los Angeles-class submarines, 650 feet official depth, likely exceeding 1,000 feet maximum. Virginia-class, official depths classified, but certainly deeper than 800 feet. Seawolf-class, reportedly capable of diving below 2,000 feet. All use descendants of Wright's original compound. Materials that have been continuously refined but trace lineage directly to formulation. 847Z developed in 1942. The progression is testament to foundational research. Wright didn't just solve immediate wartime problem. He established entire material science approach. Polysulfide polymers with inorganic fillers and cross-linking systems optimized for extreme environments. 75 years later, submarines still rely on materials based on his work. The $5 gasket became multi-billion-dollar technology that enabled nuclear deterrence, submarine reconnaissance, and undersea warfare, all from accidental discovery in chemistry laboratory during desperate wartime research. Helen Murray, the laboratory assistant whose mistake led to breakthrough, had different post-war trajectory. After war ended and male chemists returned from military service, U.S. Rubber systematically released female employees. Murray was terminated in November 1945 with 2 weeks severance pay. She applied to graduate programs in chemistry but was rejected by MIT, Caltech, and Columbia. All stated they preferred male candidates for limited positions. She eventually found work as high school chemistry teacher in Hartford, Connecticut. Wright tried to intervene. He wrote recommendation letters emphasizing Murray's contribution to Compound 847Z development. He contacted colleagues at universities, asking them to consider her applications. None succeeded. In 1946, Wright nominated Murray for Navy Distinguished Public Service Award for her role developing submarine gasket material. Navy rejected the nomination. Regulations required nominees to be officially employed on Navy contracts, and Murray's contribution, while real, was deemed laboratory assistance rather than scientific development. The award went to Wright alone. Murray taught high school chemistry for 32 years. She never published research, never received recognition for her contribution, and died in 1989 without ever knowing how many submariners owed their lives to her error and Wright's insight. Her obituary mentioned she worked briefly in defense industry during war, but included no specifics. This wasn't unusual. Thousands of women contributed to wartime research and were subsequently erased from historical record. Their work was real, their contributions measurable, but post-war narrative credited male scientists and engineers almost exclusively. Murray's case is particularly poignant because the contribution was specific and documented. Wright's laboratory notebooks explicitly recorded that she prepared formulation 847Z experimental and that excess zinc oxide was her error, but recognition never came. In 2018, historian Margaret Rossiter, researching women in science during World War II, uncovered Murray's story in U.S. Rubber Archives. Rossiter published article in ISIS, Journal of History of Science Society, detailing Murray's contribution. The article prompted minor media attention. Navy considered posthumously awarding Murray the Distinguished Public Service Award but ultimately decided against it. While her contribution was significant, sufficient time has passed that official recognition would set precedent for thousands of similar cases. Wright had died in 1976, long before Murray's contribution was publicly acknowledged. In his personal papers donated to MIT archives, researchers found a letter Wright had written to Murray in 1946 after her award nomination was rejected. Dear Helen, I am sorry the Navy cannot officially recognize your work, but I want you to know that your contribution was essential. Science advances through such moments, errors that become insights, accidents that become breakthroughs. You created one of those moments. That matters more than medals. There's no record whether Murray ever received the letter. The economic impact of Compound 847Z is difficult to calculate precisely, but certainly substantial. During World War II, U.S. submarines sank approximately 5 million tons of Japanese shipping, roughly 60% of Japan's merchant fleet. This maritime interdiction strangled Japan's economy, preventing import of oil, raw materials, and food. It was arguably most effective single military campaign of Pacific War. And it was only possible because American submarines could operate aggressively, diving deep when threatened, remaining on station for extended patrols without mechanical failures, forcing return to base. If American submarines had suffered similar gasket failure rates as German U-boats, roughly 40% mechanical failure rate when diving beyond rated depth, the campaign would have been significantly less effective. Submarines would have been forced to operate more conservatively, avoid dangerous areas, return to port more frequently for repairs. Post-war economic analysis estimated that reducing submarine effectiveness by 30% would have extended Pacific War by approximately 6 months, costing additional $50 billion in 1945 dollars and hundreds of thousands of casualties. Against this, the cost of Compound 847Z development and production was microscopic. Approximately $2 million for research and development, $30 million for wartime production. Return on investment, if measured in prevented war costs, exceeded 1,000 to 1. This calculation doesn't include intangible benefits, lives saved, technological knowledge gained, post-war applications developed from research. The broader lesson is about marginal improvements with disproportionate effects. Compound 847Z didn't revolutionize submarine design. It didn't add weapons or sensors or propulsion. It simply made existing boats more reliable in extreme conditions. But that marginal improvement, ability to dive deeper and remain submerged longer, cascaded into operational advantages that shaped campaign outcomes. Military history tends to focus on dramatic innovations, radar, code-breaking, nuclear weapons. These were undeniably important. But countless small improvements, better gaskets, improved welds, more reliable electronics, collectively mattered just as much. A submarine is system composed of thousands of components. Total reliability is product of individual component reliabilities. Improving one critical component from 90% reliable to 99% reliable increases system reliability substantially. Compound 847Z was one such improvement. It took critical component, pressure seals, from marginally adequate to highly reliable. That single improvement enabled operational doctrine changes that helped win war. The $5 gasket didn't win Pacific War alone, but it contributed measurably. And in war of attrition, where aggregate of marginal advantages determines outcomes, every contribution matters. Sometimes the most important innovations are the ones nobody notices until they fail. Gaskets that never leak are invisible, but their presence, their reliability, enables everything else. The last American submarine to use Compound 847Z-derived gaskets in combat was USS Parche, SSN 683, a Sturgeon-class attack submarine converted for special operations. Parche conducted classified missions during Cold War, earning Navy unit commendation an unprecedented 13 times, more than any vessel in naval history. Details of those missions remain classified, but unclassified sources confirm Parche conducted deep-diving operations to tap undersea communication cables and retrieve Soviet equipment from ocean floor. These operations required diving to extreme depths, certainly exceeding 1,000 feet, possibly approaching 2,000 feet, and remaining submerged for extended periods. Gasket reliability was absolutely critical. Any leak at those depths would be catastrophic, and emergency surfacing during covert operation in Soviet waters would risk international incident or combat engagement. The mission succeeded because every component, including gaskets descended from Wright's 1942 formula, performed flawlessly. Parche was decommissioned in 2004, ending 6 decades of continuous use of polysulfide-based gasket technology in U.S. submarines. Modern Virginia-class submarines use advanced fluoroelastomer gaskets, materials developed in 1990s with even better performance characteristics. But those modern materials build on foundation established by compound 847Z. The chemistry is more sophisticated, the manufacturing more precise. But the core concept, polysulfide polymer chains with inorganic reinforcement, remains identical to Wright's original invention. In 2008, Navy inducted James Wright posthumously into Naval Submarine League's Hall of Fame. Citation read, "Dr. Wright's development of high-pressure gasket material enabled American submarines to operate at depths impossible for adversaries, providing decisive tactical advantage in World War II, and continuing to protect submarine forces through Cold War era. His contribution saved countless lives and advanced submarine technology fundamentally." Helen Murray was not mentioned. Today, polysulfide rubber gaskets are ubiquitous in applications far beyond submarines. Aerospace hydraulic systems, chemical processing plants, deep-water oil drilling, medical devices. Global market for high-performance gaskets exceeds $8 billion annually. Significant fraction uses materials descended from compound 847Z. Wright's wartime research, conducted under extreme pressure to solve immediate military problem, became foundation for entire material science subfield. The progression from desperate wartime need to fundamental technological advance is common pattern. Radar, computers, jet engines, nuclear power, all were accelerated or enabled by military requirements. But compound 847Z is unusual because it was so specific and so mundane. A rubber gasket, not a weapon, not a sensor, just a seal that prevented leaks. Yet that simple component, optimized through careful chemistry and tested under extreme conditions, contributed to victory in Pacific War and enabled underwater operations for 70 years afterward. Sometimes the most important technologies are the most invisible. The true climax of this story isn't technical achievement or military victory. It's the moment when submariner realizes his life depends on component he never sees, designed by person he'll never meet, manufactured by workers whose names he'll never know. It's understanding that survival in extreme environment requires trust in anonymous others who did their work correctly. Consider submariner at 500 feet depth, hearing pressure hull creak, knowing that between him and crushing death is steel plating 7/8 inch thick and thousands of rubber gaskets holding pressure. He can't inspect those gaskets, can't verify they were manufactured correctly, can't test them except by diving and hoping they hold. His survival requires faith, not religious faith but engineering faith. Belief that material scientists understood chemistry, that manufacturers followed specifications, that quality inspectors checked properly, that everyone in chain of production did their job competently. That faith was justified because people like James Wright obsessed over molecular structure of polymers, because Helen Murray noticed when zinc oxide was added incorrectly, and Wright saw opportunity rather than error, because U.S. Rubber invested in testing, because Navy Bureau of Ships wrote detailed specifications, because factory workers measured compounds carefully, because quality inspectors rejected substandard batches, because hundreds of people enchained from laboratory to installation did their work correctly, anonymously, without knowing whose lives depended on their precision. This is profound truth about modern technology. We survive through accumulated competence of strangers. When submarine dives deep, submariner stakes his life on integrity of materials he can't see, tested by methods he doesn't understand, manufactured by people he'll never meet. And it works. The gaskets hold. The boat survives. The submariner returns home, usually never thinking about the gaskets at all. That invisibility is success. Components that work perfectly draw no attention. Only failures are noticed. The $5 gasket that held at 612 feet when USS Tang exceeded crush depth, nobody aboard thought, "Thank goodness for compound 847Z polysulfide rubber." They thought, "We survived." The gasket's contribution was invisible precisely because it succeeded. This is the real story. Not that clever chemist invented better rubber, but that invention enabled trust, enabled submariners to push boundaries, knowing their boats would hold together, enabled commanders to order deep dives, confident mechanical systems would function, enabled aggressive submarine campaign that helped win war. The $5 gasket didn't win Pacific War, but it enabled trust that allowed everything else to work. And trust in the end is what allows complex systems, whether submarines or societies, to function at all. In 2019, Virginia-class submarine USS South Dakota, SSN 790, was commissioned. The boat represents pinnacle of submarine technology, nuclear-powered, virtually unlimited range, capable of launching cruise missiles, deploying special operations forces, conducting intelligence-gathering operations. It cost $2.8 billion to build and will serve for 33 years. Somewhere in that submarine are approximately 8,000 gaskets and seals of various types, protecting pressure hull integrity, sealing hydraulic systems, maintaining environmental controls. Those gaskets are descendants of Wright's compound 847Z. The chemistry has advanced. Modern fluoroelastomers have better performance than 1940s polysulfide rubber, but the concept is identical. Polymer chains cross-linked to withstand extreme pressure while maintaining elasticity. The genealogy is direct. Every high-performance gasket in modern submarines traces lineage to desperate research conducted in Connecticut Laboratory in 1942. The cost of those 8,000 gaskets in USS South Dakota is approximately $400,000, roughly 0.014% of boat's total cost. That percentage is nearly identical to 1943, when $15,000 in gaskets represented 0.3% of submarine cost. The percentage decreased because submarine costs increased dramatically while gasket costs remained relatively stable. For that microscopic fraction of total investment, Navy ensures that every seal throughout boat will function reliably at crush depth, in extreme temperatures, exposed to seawater and chemicals, for 3 decades. This is compound 847Z's ultimate legacy, establishing expectation that critical components must be engineered for reliability far beyond normal operating parameters. Modern submarines are designed assuming gaskets will never fail. That assumption, that $5 components will perform perfectly for 30 years under extreme stress, seems audacious, but it's justified by 75 years of demonstrated performance tracing back to Wright's research. The story of $5 gasket that helped American submarines dive deeper than any German U-boat is about more than submarine warfare. It's about how small improvements cascade into strategic advantages, about how anonymous contributors, laboratory assistants, factory workers, quality inspectors, enable technological achievements credited to others, about how marginal costs, intelligently invested in reliability, generate disproportionate returns, and about how trust in engineered systems depends on accumulated competence of people we'll never meet. Wright's gasket held at pressures that should have destroyed it. Murray's error revealed chemistry that became foundation for decades of development. Thousands of submariners survived because these people, and countless others, did their work correctly. The gaskets didn't win wars. They enabled warriors to survive long enough to fight effectively. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. The invisible components that never fail deserve recognition precisely because their success makes them forgettable.